Good evening. I'm Nigel Costley. I'm the Regional Secretary for the Southwest TUC, but one of the great honours that job brings is I'm also the organiser of all things TOLPUDDLE, the annual festival, the museum. Tom DeWitt, who's coming in, he's running late as ever, but he'll be here in a minute, so manages the museum that we have there. And it's part of a great legacy, a story that we inspires us, it teaches us, it's a good excuse for an annual party, and so it's great to bring that story tonight to London, not just me talking about it, but more importantly Graham and Jill and Caroline will be singing about it, and I'm sure you'll find that Graham's lyrics that he wrote some years ago now are so great at telling the story, it almost doesn't need more of an introduction. But we're going to do a handover and mix the evening up between talking, music, a few little short films as well. And the lyrics are there for you if you wish to join in. It's not enforced community singing, but the songs are so great, I'm sure you will be inspired to join in. I see a number of familiar faces who are regulars to the TOLPUDDLE festival and who probably know the story very well. But I'm going to tell the story starting really, in many ways, this is a surprising story for people who don't know and who think of trade unions as being factory workers, coal miners, car plant. These are the stereotype of trade unionism, not beautiful Dorset. How could such a beautiful place have produced one of the great founding episodes of the trade union movement? Truth is that much, particularly the Southwest, was the centre of rebellion, revolt, trouble for many, many generations, of which TOLPUDDLE is just a part. And of course the reason for that is that the lovely cottages that you now see in TOLPUDDLE were once overcrowded hovels. Farm labourers in particular were very poorly paid, especially in Dorset, and the reasons for that I'll come on to in a moment. But the life of an average family in TOLPUDDLE was grim. In fact, the life of farm labourers across Britain was pretty awful. And there were images of the sort of class divide between the farmer, the landowner, and the worker, represented by one of the early trade union images here. And if we're going back to the 17 and early 1800s, what could working people do? Of course, some craft workers were in unions. This isn't the birth of trade unionism. Unions can trace their histories back certainly to the 1700s. They were principally craft unions, narrow occupational unions, almost with a Masonic degree of solidarity with one another, and they existed and survived and sustained themselves throughout the period when it was illegal to be in a union through what was called the Combination Acts. But for most people, denied any real influence, denied the vote, what could they do to resist starvation wages, to resist changes in their life that was going to threaten their very survival? And the answer was, of course, to riot. It's an expression that isn't always, it summons up a sort of drunken mob smashing windows. Actually, what history often shows as a riot was quite a well-organised, disciplined event, and operating like Robin Hood style fashion, particularly against profiteers. There was food riots, there were bread riots, there were cider riots, there were riots over tolls, and during the 1830s there was a particular depression in agriculture, where particularly the south of Britain suffered very, very badly. And so what became known as the Swing Rebellion broke out. Started in Kent and swept across most of the southern part of Britain. It consisted of writing letters to the master, to the employer. And why it's called the Swing Rebellion is the letters were written in the name of a fictitious Captain Swing. And invariably, the farm workers would post the letter to their employer saying, paraphrasing, but we want more money, or else, or smash that threshing machine that was being blamed for the unemployment and falling wages, or else signed Captain Swing. And a day or so later, the farm workers would come round and smash the machine and burn the ricks. There wasn't much physical person-to-person violence, but you can see by this chart, which I've tried to put on the chart, where there were rick burnings or machine breaking. You get a general picture of the way it spread. Literally, night after night, it moved further west, and there were hot spots around Wiltshire. There was a sort of a little hot spot around Tolpuddle and the valley there, Puddletown. There's much controversy later on as to whether or not the 6 Tolpuddle martyrs had any involvement in this. There's George Lovelace actually talks about being a watchman to mind out for people rioting. The squire, the baddie in this story, accused them all of being associated with the riots. I think we'll come on to that in a moment. But one of the reasons why Dorset in particular was so poor is the land is poor. The ground upon which people were born and worked and lived is so important to the story of history. And in this case, the land is chalk and it's poor, so wages tended to be poor. And they all had all sorts of very clever ways, like water meadows, the management of sheep, so they shit in the right place, basically, to eke out even the slightest bit of fertility and value of the land, but wages were poor. If you move further west or further north, you go onto clay soils, and you then get the dairy industry, cheddar, and the Devon dairy. Hence the difference between the chalk and the cheese. So that was Swing, and that's really the starting point of this story. Captain Swing.
Right, thank you for being patient with us. We've got a cellist here tonight, Jill Redman, and it's a bit of a problem getting that up on the train, you know, but we got it here in one piece. It's always a bit intimidating when someone like me chups up and says, join in if you can. Well, you know, what I'm saying is these songs are written in the folk sort of idiom, which is heavily chorus-based. All you've got to do to satisfy me is to sort of go like that with your lips every now and then. Or, as I often say, appropriate here, Methodist harmony. That's any note other than one that I'm singing. That's lovely, yeah. The sun's gone down, the shutter's drawn, the curfew bell is tolled, the fox is lurking round the farm, the barn owl's wings unfold in the candlelight. Tonight you might hear to your alarm the midnight band of Captain Swing as he rides from farm to farm. All over Dorset the flames are leaping high. Oh, the ricks are burning, who's the cause? Captain Swing, not I. All over Dorset, the flames are leaping high. Oh, the ricks are burning, who's the cause? Captain Swing, not I. The sheep are safely in their fold. The shepherd deeply sleeps, the ploughman reels back from his drink. Through woods the poacher creeps, the squire retires on bed of brass, with one thing on his mind: if Captain swings this way tonight, there'll be no corn to grind. All over Dorset the flames are leaping high. Oh, the ricks are burning, who's the cause? Captain, swing not I. All over Dorset the flames are leaping high. Oh, the ricks are burning, who's the cause? Captain, swing not I. The labouring man is on his knees. Nowhere can he get hired, since new machines that do the work the farmer has acquired. But how he sweats when he reads the threats on paper morning brings: destroy your gear or else I swear you'll pay, sign Captain Swing. All over Dorset the flames are leaping high. Oh, the ricks are burning, who's the cause? Captain, swing not I. All over Dorset the flames are leaping high. Oh, the ricks are burning, who's the cause? Captain, swing not I.
Thank you. Graham Moore and Jill Redmond. Be hearing more from them throughout the evening, obviously. But the story of Captain Swing was pretty grim. The authorities, whilst initially taken aback by this, the scale of this rebellion, they quickly got on top of things, and the yeomanry, special constables, the authorities generally clamped down hard, and special commission was arranged to try those that were arrested. A couple were hanged, but most were transported. Others were imprisoned. So the end result was pretty harsh, and I think that convinced the TOLPUDDLE men that was not the way to deal with falling wages. Wages already low were cut. Once the Swing Rebellion had been sort of seen off, the employers took the advantage of cutting pay even more. So the Dorset pay, 9 shillings a week, lower than the other districts, was cut to 8. Then 7, and then there was further threat to cut it to 6. This was already what would be seen as sort of starvation wages. So a group of farm workers, led by George Lovelace, went and met the employers, the farmers, in the vicarage in the centre of TOLPUDDLE. They met with Thomas, the parson, the Reverend Warren, and downstairs, when you get a chance on your way out, if you haven't seen it on the way in, there's an exhibition thanks to the Marx Memorial Library, and also some letters that we've just acquired, written by the Reverend. He has always been seen as the betrayer of the TOLPUDDLE martyrs, but at this particular meeting, he made the promise to the farm workers, being a witness to the meeting that they had with the employers. Basically, he could do nothing for their situation as it was, but if the employers should attempt to cut the pay any more, then he would intervene. I would undertake to see you righted, so help me God. He went on to deny saying that and making that promise to the farm workers. Not really surprising which side he was on, given that the vicarage and the wages he was being paid was basically coming from the squire and the employers. And also, of course, the village of TOLPUDDLE was in some ferment over religion itself. many of the 5 of the 6 TOLPUDDLE martyrs were Methodists. There is the original chapel in TOLPUDDLE opened a few years before this, but when it was opened, the stones were thrown. George Lovelace later wrote, "What chance has a labouring man of obtaining justice if the clergyman of the parish is ill disposed towards him?" And faced with the betrayal of the church, further cuts in pay by the employers, George Lovelace, and an acknowledgement that rioting only led to jail and transportation, George Lovelace said the answer is solidarity. It's trade unionism. It's this thing that has now been made legal. The Combination Acts have been repealed. Trade unionism was growing around the country. That's the answer. But we'd have to do it secretly. We'd have to build up our support, make sure we've got as many members as possible, that would then give us a degree of bargaining power with our employers. They met famously under the sycamore tree that still stands in TOLPUDDLE. The National Trust, who own it, reckon they measured it a few years ago, 320 years old. So it would have certainly been there at the time. And I'm sure farm workers on their way to and from the fields would have met in the village green and argued and discussed how on earth are we going to feed our families unless we do something about our pay. And so they formed a union, a friendly society of agricultural labourers. They got some advice from some people from London, mysterious characters who came down and gave them some advice. Similar advice, as an aside, was being given to bricklayers in Exeter. And actually, the same oath was taken in both places. But in TOLPUDDLE and around, the society had a sort of an initiation. Some say it was a bit like when you sign the sort of tick the box that, I agree to the terms and conditions that nobody ever reads. But in those days, without sort of literacy for most people, this was a way of binding people. There were sort of echoes of Masons and religion about it, but the oath was taken where you promised to keep the secrets of the society, and you were combining together lawfully to keep peace, but to share with one another, to protect one another, and to share in your interests. And the People's History Museum in Manchester has got one of the very rare examples of the original. This isn't the actual TOLPUDDLE banner, but it's very similar, of the design that was put up behind people to obviously scare them into, you're looking at death with your hand on the Bible, swearing to share and to keep the secrets of the society. Now, it would have been hard to do anything in a village like this without the word spreading, and Squire Frampton, petrified of the French Revolution coming to Britain, based in his manor in Morton, which is a nearby village, but he was the squire of the area. He gets word of the fact that society, and he writes to the Home Secretary. So we have this correspondence between him and the Home Secretary, and he writes, "Societies are forming amongst the agricultural labourers, combinations of a dangerous and alarming kind." And the Home Secretary, then Lord Melbourne, writes back, knowing that unions are now legal. What could he do about it? They might be dangerous, but he wasn't about to reenact the Combination Acts and risk even more of a riot and rebellion. So he writes, or his office writes back to Squire Frampton, simply hinting that whilst unions might be legal, he sort of suggests you might like to look up the law relating to the administration of secret oaths. So joining a union might be legal, but taking a secret oath is unlawful under an obscure mutiny act in the Navy. So Squire Frampton writes back. He is in a state of panic. It comes out off the page as you read the letters, how these societies are extending rapidly to parishes hitherto not infected by them. He has attempts to have spies to watch. They were meeting on the common outside of Tolpuddle, but he moans, he complains that they've got sentries and it's hard to get the evidence needed. And he talks about measures should be adopted to restore their minds to the usual state of quietness and order. They need to know their place. None of this sort of trade union business. Again, Lord Melbourne then has to remind him again that they are legal, providing they don't resort to violence or illegal oaths. So the squire is determined to get evidence that they're taking this oath, and he manages to get a spy to join Edward Legg. Not the brightest of individuals, it has to be said. His evidence in court was pretty thin. But the oath is taken in the upstairs room of Thomas Stanfield's cottage. You can just, at the little sort of building beyond the Land Rover is the original chapel, the original Methodist chapel that is being restored as a space. They're trying to raise money for it now. But in this room upstairs, the oath was taken. And he'd got his evidence. He'd got Legg to be the spy. Having got the evidence, he then posted a notice. So after the meeting had happened, notices are posted in the village warning people that taking secret oaths, people would be guilty of felony. So the trap was sprung, and the quickly followed, literally within days, arrest of 6 men that are considered to be leaders. These images were taken somewhat later, and these are the only sort of images we've got of what they look like. On their arrest, of course, they had their heads shaved, but the 6 were arrested. Interesting feature, James Hammett there at the end was always slightly different. James Hammett wasn't actually at the meeting. He wasn't part of this oath. They arrested the wrong bloke. But his brother was. And his brother had a larger family, and I think he took the rap, basically, for his brother. He never betrayed his brother. He went to trial in full knowledge that he wasn't actually at the meeting. They were on the February morning, the constable arrived knocking at the doors, and they were arrested and marched into Dorchester, 8 miles or so down the road.
Let's come in. You might notice that I've had my head shaved to look like they did in court. And I've lost an enormous amount of weight in the last month to try and look like a starving transport. 6 brave men, we've read your story, the trial, the grief, the pain and the glory at the hands of the squire, the Whig and the Tory in England's pleasant land. Well, that I could ask you one last question, one last thought for your reflection. Did you lose all hope? Pray for protection on the road to Dorchester. On the road, on the road. By the masters of oppression, you were taken from your land. On the road, on the road. The immortal power of freedom took you by the hand. Did you wake with a dread in the dark day dawning? Did the sun force away through the clouds of the morning? Did the lark on the wing above you soaring freely in the sky? What thoughts did you share? What fears were growing? Do you think you'd be home for the cock was crowing? Do you think you'd be land where you'd be going? On the road to Dorchester, on the road, on the road. By the masters of taken from your land. On the road, on the road, the immortal power of freedom took you by the hand. As you cross Gray's Bridge with the jail ahead, past the spire of the church and the graves of the dead, do you feel regret for the things you said, the oath that you had sworn? Were you sure in your heart that your cause was right? Were you firmly resolved to stand and fight for the right to resist the master's might and for children yet unborn? On the road, give it a go. On the road, by the masters of oppression, you were taken from your land. On the road, on the road, the immortal power of freedom took you by the hand. That road was trod before you came. Since you've gone, it's been trod again in trial and grief, glory and pain in England's pleasant land. Well, the road's still there, and so's the town where you stood for your rights, and your renown is there on the road. You walk down the road to Dorchester. On the road, on the road, by the masters of oppression, you were taken from your land. On the road, on the road, the immortal power of freedom took you by the hand. On the road, on the road, by the masters of oppression, you were taken from your land. On the road, on the road, the immortal power of freedom took you by the hand. The immortal power of freedom took you by the hand.
They were taken into Dorchester and put on trial in the Shire Hall courtroom. The building has literally just been opened after a major refurbishment that we've spent years raising funds, and thanks to the Heritage Lottery Fund and the local council, it is now a new major visitor attraction in Dorset. So if you get a chance, if you're ever in Dorset and Dorchester, pay it a visit. It's good inside, tells the story not just of the TOLPUDDLE martyrs. They are the most famous to be tried in the building, but there are many other stories about really injustice at that time in Britain. These are the cells where the martyrs were actually held. They're really designed just for a brief stop while you're being taken to actually into the court, but the martyrs were kept for several days and deliberately kept in poor conditions. There's talk of the fire being deliberately stoked with green wood in order to smoke out the room and make their lives as bad as possible. The courtroom has been restored apparently to its original colours. A lot of research went on to try and drill down to find out what was the paint in 1834, and the courtroom is structured with hierarchy in mind. You've got the grand jury, the masters, basically the squires, sitting above the actual jury. The jury was sworn in. They're all farmers, so the employers. One of them was contested because he admitted to hearing George Lovelace preaching in one of his many sort of open-air Methodist services. And for that, he was ruled out as having a conflict of interest. The fact that the others were employers of farm workers, it was a completely staged, loaded event. The trial itself, in our terms, was a mockery. The actual defendants weren't allowed to speak. they did have legal representation, but you weren't allowed to speak until sentence was passed. So George Lovelace got to say a few words only after he'd been found guilty. And so conditions were poor. The trial was over very quickly. There is an account of the trial, and the aftermath, the immediate aftermath, is partly told downstairs if you get a chance to look at the Marks Memorial Library displays, because they've got the original newspapers that tell all the stories, but we've got the transcripts of the trial. We had some short little films made for a trail that you can download free online at the TOLPUDDLE Martyrs website. So a couple of little clips to help tell the story.
We will plow, we will sow, we'll reap and we will bow.
As soon as we got to prison, our clothes were stripped off and searched, our heads were shorn, and we were locked together in a room where we remained day and night. Mr. Young, an attorney employed on our behalf, called me into the conversation room and, among other things, inquired if I would promise the magistrate to have no more to do with the union if they would let me go home to my wife and family. Do you mean to say that I had to betray my companions? That's just it, he said. No, I would rather undergo any punishment. I had never seen the inside of a jail before, but now I began to feel it. Disagreeable company, close confinement, bad breath, and what is worse, hard and cold lodging. And this, said I to my companions, is our fare for striving to live honest.
The judge, at the end of the short trial, said an example must be made, and you will be transported to land beyond the seas, was the expression, for the maximum of 7 years. But they would have known that transportation for almost everyone meant life. Very few people ever came back from transportation because you had to buy your fare back. So a lot of people, and they would have known this from the Swing Rebellion, that transportation was more often than not the end to seeing their families and friends, going off to a mysterious place beyond the seas, the like of which they could not have possibly imagined. George Lovelace himself, due to the conditions in the jail and the cells, was considered too ill to travel. They didn't want a martyr, they didn't want to kill him. So 5 of the 6 men were sent for transportation, and George Lovelace had to recover sufficiently to go to Portsmouth to be transported later. But on his way out of the Shire Hall, no doubt crowds outside to witness, he handed a piece of paper. He'd found a poem. He isn't the author of this. He got it, we think, from a Chartist. It certainly was sung at a Chartist rally in Birmingham. We're not sure who actually was the scribe of this poem, but it finishes, or the chorus is, "We raise the watchword liberty, we will be free." Hi, Fiona. So, at that point, of course, they must have thought that is the end for them, that they're going away, never to see their families again. Their families equally would have been distraught at what was to behold them. But of course, this is just the start of what we now celebrate. But over to you, Graham, Jill.
Farewell to my family. It's now I must leave you, that far fatal shore. In chains we shall see, although we are taken. Do not be mistaken, as brothers in union, we shall be free. They can bring down our wages, starve all our children. In chains they can bind us, steal all our land. They can mock our religion, from our family divide us, but they can't break the oath of a TOLPUDDLE man. To those who rule us, we are the dissenters. Do your duty, be thankful. Don't complain, we are taught, for God in his wisdom divided his kingdom, for few to have much, while so many have naught. They can bring down our wages, starve all our children, in chains they can bind us, steal all our land. They can mock our religion, from our family divide us, but they can't break the oath of a TOLPUDDLE man. As brothers together, with an oath we will bind us. The labouring poor in all England shall rise. Though Frampton has framed us, they never will tame us. Arise then in union, we'll yet win the prize. They can bring down our wages, starve all our children, in chains they can bind us, steal all our land. They can mock our religion, from our family divide us, but they can't break the oath of a TOLPUDDLE man. Give it a go. They can bring down our wages, starve all our children, in chains they can bind us, steal all our land. They can mock our religion, from our family divide us, but they can't break the oath of a TOLPUDDLE man. No, they can't break the oath of a TOLPUDDLE man.
So George was taken to the York Hulk. These were old ships moored off most of our estuaries, actually, for prisoners awaiting the long journey to Australia. It would have taken about 6 months via Rio. It's a long way around. Perilous journey. Many didn't survive the journey. Conditions on board were atrocious. And of course, when they got there, life was slavery. But whilst the story will come on to in terms of the conditions they faced, the wives, children of them, of the martyrs, were also in peril. They had absolutely no income and were destitute. They appealed for parish relief, the then form of universal credit. And just as now, of course, it's used as a form of discipline, I think, on working class people. But guess who managed the parish relief? The Squire Frampton, who said if your men had sufficient money to join the union, they've got sufficient money to pay you. And I suggest you go and ask the union for aid. They didn't know what the union was even. And so they thought that, they must have just been absolutely desperate. But of course the then story changes, because the word was out, and the unions, the fledgling unions, realised that this was a challenge they could not ignore. This was an injustice they could not ignore. And what's interesting by the correspondence is that Frampton was angry at them forming a union. He was furious when he discovered that strangers appeared, giving them money. The unions were collecting. They were not just organising for justice and the freedom of the Tolpuddle, the Dorchester labourers, but they made sure that their wives and families were protected, and subscriptions came in, and people came down to Tolpuddle to make sure that the families were looked after. For the martyrs themselves, the Dorchester labourers on the other side of the world, the slavery conditions must have been a complete, absolute shock in terms of a completely different environment that they were faced with, forced into pretty brutal conditions in the Iron Gang.
From Wiltshire there were swingmen, poachers from the west, drag sneaks from Newgate who steal away a vest. They marched us out together, boys, how our shackles rang, pounding rock to dust on the old Iron Gang. And it's swing that hammer, lads, move your bastards' work, a dose of the triangle if you try to shirk. They marched us out together, boys, how our shackles rang, pounding rock to dust on the old Iron Gang. Through the bush and sandstone we cut the western road, starving, lame and blistered we bent under the load. They marched us out like horses, how our shackles rang, pounding rock to dust on the old Iron Gang. And it's swing that hammer, lads, move your bastards' work, a dose of the triangle if you try to shirk. They marched us out together, boys, how our shackles rang, pounding rock to dust on the old Iron Gang. With a log for me pillow and a piece of bark for bed, 3 trousers and a lot, our feet and fingers bled. They worked us to the bone, me boys, how our shackles rang, pounding rock to dust on the old Iron Gang. And they swing that hammer, lads, move your bastards' work, a dose of the triangle if you try to shirk. They marched us out together, boys, how our shackles rang, pounding rock to dust on the old Iron Gang, pounding rock to dust on the old Iron Gang.
So back here, the word was out and the story was covered in the press, and it got around the country, and there was this great sense of injustice. What could working people do? These were people trying to keep within the law. Even then they were still stitched up. This was an image of the Times showing the Dorchester labourers appealing to the Crown, only for him to turn away and show his arse. And petitions started coming in. Public meetings were being arranged all over the country. This is a notice from Huddersfield. People clearly were captivated by this sense of injustice, and also the sense that this was a challenge to emerging trade unionism that we had to face. The Robert Owen's Grand National Consolidated Trade Union, this big union that they had formed a branch of, knew that it was a threat that they had to mobilise against. And mobilise they did in ways that were startling, probably even today when we've got the advantages of Facebook and Twitter, let alone in those days. And there were big meetings to organise the defence campaign, the freedom campaign, leading up to this huge demonstration through London, starting at Copenhagen Fields, which is just north of King's Cross. Indeed, this is the route march past just just down the road there, Tottenham Court Road, and turned right in Oxford Road, road up to Oxford Circus. And reading the accounts of this demonstration, this isn't just any other demonstration that we know and love. The government itself was clearly in a state of panic. Where was this going? Was this the start of revolutionary fervour in Britain? What were they going to do? The forces that the government marshalled for this event consisted of lifeguards, household troops, detachments of the 12th and 7th Lancers, 2 troops of the 2nd Dragoons, 8 battalions of infantry, 29 pieces of ordnance and cannon, 5,000 special constables. And they were clearly preparing for more than just a peaceful march, but the actual unions were determined it was going to be a peaceful march. And they marched with decorum. Apparently the shops all closed, people were crowded onto the rooftops to watch this go by. The petition was so large it had to be carried 12 people shoulder high. And interesting accounts, people formed up in their sort of trades, in their unions. If you look at the different banners consisted of the different unions, and one account talked about the disparity between the different trades. The tailors had a jauntiness of carriage and due exercise to their art in personal adornment. I think that means they dressed well. Carpenters, masons, bricklayers have all the externals of the English mechanic. The smiths and metal workers looked a little dingy, while the silk weavers, almost painful to speak, they walked in squalid misery, and the coal heavers had a turn for the boisterous. Truly, it says, one half of the world knows not what the other half is doing. The weekly True Sun newspaper said, "This is not a common procession of petitioners, but a nation in movement." And the Pioneer, which was the union's newspaper, said, "Last Monday was a day in Britain's history which long will be remembered, for Labour put its hat upon its head and walked towards the throne." The march went past Whitehall, where Lord Melbourne was in residence. They banged on his door to deliver this enormous petition hundreds of thousands of people had signed. He peered through the curtains but refused to come out. So they marched on over the bridge onto Kennington Common. It didn't stop there. Just one march is never enough, but it did prompt radical MPs to come out in their support, particularly Thomas Wakeley. It caused more petitions to arrive from Cheltenham, from Bristol, from Birmingham. It caused lawyers to take up the case. Surely taking of a secret oath. Didn't the royal family take a secret oath when they joined the Orange Order and the Masons? If it's good enough for them, why not for farm workers? So there were legal challenges, long speeches in Parliament, and the pressure built to free the Dorchester labourers.
From a distant town, I can hear the anvil ring round a blazing fire. 1,000 voices sing of a time coming soon, when the order shall reverse, where the first shall be lost and the last shall be the first. We will bring them home. We will bring them home from the claws of the mighty, with their hearts of stone. We will bring them home. We will bring them home. We'll reach out across the ocean and we'll bring them home. in the deepest mine and the dark satanic mill, in the cutting of the seam and the spinning of the wheel, on the raging sea and the plowing of the land. Many tongues do the talk of the rights of man. We will bring them home. We will bring them home from the claws of the mighty with their hearts of stone. We will bring them home. We will bring them home. We'll reach out across the ocean and we'll bring them home. From an acorn small, a mighty oak will rise. If we speak as one, we'll together win the prize. Raise your voices high, let them ring throughout the land. And for justice now, we'll together make a stand. We will bring them home. We will bring them home from the doors of the mighty with their hearts of stone. We will bring them home. We will bring them home. We'll reach out across the ocean and we'll bring them home. We will bring, come on, them home. We will bring them home from the claws of the mighty with their hearts of stone. We will bring them home. We will bring them home. We'll reach out across the ocean and we'll bring them home.
They were actually brought home. There were some negotiations, a bit tricky when you're 6 months away, and it was quite difficult because George Lovelace discovered that he'd been given a free pardon in a newspaper. His master, the governor in Tasmania, didn't tell him, and he found out about it and had to confront and wrote his own letter to the paper because he didn't trust the governor to actually give him the truth. And then, because part of the negotiations, which George only was getting snippets of, was to send the families over to Australia. We'll just ship the families out to Australia and get rid of this problem and we'll be done with them. And George was having none of it. He wanted his justice. He wanted free pardon and a return home, and he was prepared to stick to it. But of course he wasn't absolutely sure whether his wife Betsy had been put on a ship. So he couldn't just jump on a ship. They might have crossed mid-ocean. So he waited for months, and the ship arrived from Britain with a letter from Betsy saying that she is staying, she is not going to Australia. So he was able to get back on that ship and to return home. They all eventually came home at different times, but a grand public meeting was organised to celebrate their return. By now, all but James Hammett had arrived back. They actually did the march again, but in reverse order. And they marched to what is now the New Vic Theatre for this public dinner. Apparently, George Lovelace was so emotional he couldn't speak, and they also, of course, faced the problem of they might be home, but the employers in TOLPUDDLE are never going to re-employ them. So what are we going to do with the Dorchester labourers now we've freed them? So a subscription was organised. The money that had already been coming in to campaign for their freedom was added to by what was called the Dorchester Labourers Farm Tribute. Enough money was raised through various means, a select ball to raise money for the families of the Dorchester labourers. And they raised enough money to rent farms in Essex, where the local vicar didn't like the idea at all of these troublemakers arriving in his parish But nonetheless, they settled in Essex for a few years. They also got involved in the Chartist movement. George Lovelace himself wrote a number of pamphlets, both about his experience, but also a stinging rebuke of the church called The Church Shown Up, which is an attack on the established church and its part in this story. He also wrote a book called The Victims of Whiggery about the story. There are points where they turn up as public speakers in Chartist rallies as well.
Despite their free pardons, the martyrs would not get work from the farmers back in Tolpuddle. A fundraising campaign was launched called the Dorchester Labourers Farm Tribute. The aim was to raise enough money to buy a farm for the Tolpuddle men, because it was felt that they had earned the right to a better life than that of poor labourers. Events were held nationally and money began to pour in. When sufficient money was raised, leases were bought on 2 farms in Essex. The families moved there, although James Hammett soon returned to Tolpuddle, where he lived for the rest of his life. The other men stayed in Essex and continued to strive for better working conditions for farm workers. After 7 years, when the lease to the farms was about to expire, the families decided to move to Canada. They all lived on farms in Ontario for the rest of their lives.
Wasted and worn, tattered and torn from the land I love best, on a ship sailing west, around me they cried. She leaned and sighed, farewell, it's the last of England. Thousands are sailing far from this shore to promise of freedom, hope for the poor. Around me they cried. She leaned out and sighed, farewell, it's the last of England. Thoughts of the past flooded my mind, tears filled our eyes, no words could we find as we set sail into the gale. Farewell, it's the last of England. Thousands are sailing far from this shore to promise of freedom, hope for the poor. Around me they cried. She leaned and sighed, farewell, it's the last of England. Those who are mistreated, put down, abused, by moneyed and landed, all help refused. They've made their choice to cry with one voice, farewell, it's the last of England. Thousands are sailing far from this shore to promise of freedom, hope for the poor. Around me they cried. She leaned and sighed, farewell, it's the last of England. Farewell, it's the last of England.
We don't entirely know their reasoning for emigrating. It may well have been, some said that they couldn't cope with the celebrity status that they'd achieved as farm workers, some that they became disillusioned, some that the lease was running out. It may well have been that their experience of going to Australia showed them that actually the world there was a place for them elsewhere in the world. They apparently agreed not to talk about the story when they got to Canada, but apparently it soon got out. And indeed, in Canada now, there is a whole set of memorials. There are streets named after them, libraries, parks. They have an annual event in Canada to remember the story. It's part of the Canadian labour movement history, as some of these pictures show. The one exception was James Hammett. Perhaps he was always the odd one out, but he was also a building labourer, wasn't a farm worker, so he was able to come back to Tolpuddle and work. He had family in the trade, so to speak, so he came back to Tolpuddle, where he lived out his days. He was remembered. The story immediately became part of the episode, a key episode in the labour movement story, and has been remembered ever since. And James Hammett was given an illuminated address, which now hangs in the Tolpuddle Museum, and an engraved watch. But the story is not an easy ending. It never is. The Farm Workers Union has always, and still today, struggles to organise. It is probably the hardest of workers to organise into trade unions because they are amongst the most vulnerable. So there are a number of false starts for the National Union of Agricultural Workers. There was an outburst of strikes across the country which led to mass sackings and evictions. If you're a farm worker, you often relied on your employer for accommodation. And these pictures were taken of evictions in Dorset during the period of striking, which is about 1878. And people turned out en masse, really, to give support to the families being evicted from their cottages. So it wasn't easy to form trade unionism amongst agriculture. And I would say today, the sort of jobs that the Dorchester labourers did then would probably now be done by migrant labour, often also vulnerable to exploitation, particularly if we have a new work permit system as is being talked about. It's even worse because you're effectively bonded to the employer that you've arrived at. And given, if I stray into modern current politics, but given that they're looking to reach out beyond Europe to recruit, gangmasters will recruit from the poorest parts of the world, people who are even more likely to be more vulnerable to exploitation. And I think we've got a challenge as trade unions. How do we stop that from happening? How do we protect the most vulnerable in society, even when the labour force still gives us real problems as to how to recruit and organise temporary, casual migrant labour? But the story of Tolpuddle became a real inspiration on its centenary in 1834. The TUC went big time to celebrate the story and organised big events in Dorchester. They arranged all sorts of activities and also acquired some land from the Debenham family, a little patch of land where the TUC built 6 cottages, one for each of the martyrs. It was felt appropriate, given the circumstances, that farm workers, particularly those active in a union, should be given a place of retirement in Tolpuddle. So one for each farm, for each martyr, with a tiny room in the middle, which would be a rest room, a common room, which has evolved into what is now the museum and the shop next door. But this was the dedication of those cottages. And George Lansbury, the then Labour leader, came and unveiled a new headstone for James Hammett. And these grand processions in Dorchester There were sports activities, band competitions, new drama, theatre. There was a great volume of a book written to tell the story. Lots of stuff going on. And of course, before that, the archway, it's going back a little bit out of order, but Arthur Henderson unveiled the first physical thing in structure in Tolpuddle outside what is called the new Methodist Chapel. And down the years, it became a bit of an annual event, a few gaps, but generally, ever since the 1930s, there has been pilgrimages and an annual rally at Tolpuddle. And all the great figures of the Labour movement have come at some point to speak, to pay tribute. In different ways. It reflected almost the story of the Labour movement through the 20th century. There were big rows during the Cold War about communists coming on the march. It ebbed and flowed during peak periods of industrial action. Lots of politicians. This is just a small selection of some that you might remember. This is one of the first times that both spoke on the same rally. And of course, leaders of the trade union movement, general secretaries, always had it etched into their diary to come to speak at Tolpuddle. But we also now have lots of other discussions throughout the weekend. There's programmes for you to show you, give you a flavour of what's coming up this year. But it was, I think, in the 1990s, looking a little sad, it has to be said. Those people who perhaps went there in those days, it was a bit of a duty. We refreshed it, and I think we're proud of the festival as it is now. It's a great event. It's enjoyable. We have lots of political discussions and great speakers. But it's also for kids, people growing up now through coming to festival, and it's a celebration of trade unionism and solidarity. It's not a funeral march. It is bright and breezy and enjoyable, and it attracts now the families. It's one of the great emotional moments when the families lay wreaths at the graveyard. So please, if you get chance, this gives you a little flavour.
People fought for trade unions, they fought for the right to vote, and if that was worth fighting for then it's worth fighting for now.
The good thing about Tolpuddle Festival is that there's something for everybody.
This is the spirit, this is the heart and soul of the trade union movement.
Tolpuddle is just the landmark of my life.
This is a night out for us. This is just a brilliant night of celebration.
It's a chance for all of us to recharge our batteries, to debate politically, but also to have a drink with good friends, enjoy ourselves and get ready for the fight ahead.
It's quite moving, isn't it, that you think these people were here, this is where history happened, and then you're stood on the same side. I think it's got a bigger place in society than ever. I think we need more things like this, because everyone's got this common interest, and it's great that you can talk to people who have the same passions that you do.
We don't just look back in history and celebrate the history, but it's an occasion for us to reevaluate where do we go from here. If we don't organise now, all of those things that all of those people who went before us fought so hard for will go.
It's really the best sort of like political festival, I think, in the UK. It's outside of London. It's not about our industrial heritage, it's about our rural heritage, and it's only about 30 minutes from where I live. So all those together,
it's a celebration of everything that we, as a class can fight for and can move towards. And that should involve dancing and singing and laughing and joking, and that should be central to it.
Everyone comes for a different reason. You've got the political side of it, you've got the festival side, the music, and obviously now the family. And every year we've got more and more family coming. I think there's about 20 relatives here at the moment.
When you come and you see all these people, so many old friends, so many trade union banners, speeches, it's an inspiration to the movement. A lot of people wonder whether you can succeed, and then you look back on the Tolpuddle martyrs and the sacrifice they made for what they believed in, and then people say, well, if they could do it, we can do it. So it gives people hope.
No, they can't break the oath of a TOLPUDDLE man.
As brothers and sisters, with an oath we will bind us. The labouring poor in all England shall rise. Though Frampton has framed us, they never will tame us. Arise in union, we'll yet win the prize. Got it there. They can bring down our wages, starve all our children. In chains they can bind us, steal all our land. They can mock our religion, from our family divide us, but they can't break the oath of a TOLPUDDLE man. I just want to say I'm proud to be associated with this, and I've got to thank the trade union, the TUC, Nigel, obviously in particular, for getting things going and getting that festival back on its feet. And I've got to say Dick Musket for all the work he did on the music, and it's been a great thing to be associated. They can bring down our wages, starve all our children. In chains they can bind us, steal all our land. They can mock our religion, from our family divide us, but they can't break the oath of a TOLPUDDLE man. No, they can't break the oath of a TOLPUDDLE person.
Thank you, Graham Moore, Jill Redman, and Caroline, of course, as well.